After a fierce battle between three great armies, the desert near Al-Babein had gone silent. Only the wind moved now, dragging dust over broken shields and splintered spears. Beneath the circling crows lay the ruin of two armies that should not have fallen. Christian Crusader knights in torn mail lay dead beside Egyptian soldiers who had marched under Muslim banners. Enemies turned allies, buried in the same sand. They had believed they were smelling victory, but it was the smell of death. Against impossible odds, the Syrian army had won. But for one young Kurdish commander standing among the victors, glory felt hollow. Looking out over the carnage, he realized a grim truth. Victory doesn't end suffering. It only decides who is left alive to remember it. The battlefield had given him a brilliant strategic lesson, but it had not given him peace. So, how did an allied army of Crusaders and Egyptians get shattered by the very force it outnumbered and had chased across Egypt to destroy? It's 1154. The balance around Jerusalem had changed. Nur al-Din had taken Damascus. For the Crusader kingdom of Jerusalem, that was not a distant Syrian event. Damascus had always mattered because it stood close enough to threaten the Latin frontier, but independent enough to be bargained with, pressured, or used against other enemies. Once Nur al-Din brought it under his authority, the kingdom faced a more organized power from the north and east. Jerusalem still had advantages. It had fortified cities, experienced nobles, the military orders, and ports that tied it to the wider Latin West. Its knights remained dangerous in open battle when they could choose the time and ground, but the kingdom was narrow, and its manpower was limited. A major defeat could not be repaired easily. Nur al-Din understood that. So did Amalric of Jerusalem. When Amalric became king in 1163, he looked south and saw the future of the war. Egypt was weak, rich, and divided. The Fatimid Caliph still sat in Cairo, but real authority belonged to the Vizier, and the Vizierate had become a prize fought over by ambitious men. Egypt had the Nile, grain, tax revenue, Mediterranean ports, and access to the Red Sea. It could feed armies and pay soldiers in a way the rocky frontier lands of Palestine could not. If Amalric took Egypt, Jerusalem would become much harder to destroy. If Nur al-Din took Egypt, Jerusalem could be trapped between Syria and the Nile. That was why Amalric invaded Egypt in 1163, the same year he came to the throne. The campaign failed. The Nile flood, local resistance, and the difficulty of holding ground in Egypt forced the Franks back. Still, the attempt proved something dangerous. Egypt was reachable. A king of Jerusalem could march there, test the defenses, and return. Once that was clear, the struggle became unavoidable. The next opening did not come from Jerusalem or Damascus. It came from Cairo itself. The Fatimid court was unstable, and the office of vizier had become more powerful than the caliph himself. Shawar, one of the men fighting for that office, was driven out by his rival Durgam. With no way to recover power on his own, Shawar went to Syria and asked Nur al-Din for help. Nur al-Din had reasons to hesitate. Sending an army into Egypt meant crossing near Crusader territory, stretching supply lines, and entering a political world famous for betrayal. Yet the reward was enormous. If his men could secure influence in Cairo, the Crusader states would face pressure from two directions. Nur al-Din chose Asad al-Din Shirkuh for the task. Shirkuh was a Kurdish commander, rough, experienced, and aggressive. He had the kind of temperament needed for a campaign where diplomacy might change overnight and where retreat could become as important as attack. With Shirkuh came his nephew, Yusuf ibn Ayyub, the man later generations would remember as Saladin. Saladin did not enter this story as a young conqueror rushing toward destiny. He resisted the expedition. According to the famous story, he said he would not go to Egypt even if he were made king of it. The irony would become almost too perfect. His uncle took him anyway. In 1164, Shirkuh entered Egypt, broke Durgam's position, and restored Shawar to power. For Shawar, the Syrian army had done exactly what he asked. It had given him Cairo again. Then came the betrayal. Once Shawar was back in power, the men who had saved him became the threat he feared most. He had not invited Shirkuh into Egypt so that Syria could rule through him. He wanted his office, not a master. To remove the Syrian army, Shawar turned toward the very enemy Nur al-Din feared would seize the Nile. He called Amalric of Jerusalem. Amalric understood the invitation immediately. A Syrian army inside Egypt was a strategic emergency. If Shirkuh remained near Cairo, Nur al-Din's influence would sink into the Nile Valley, so Amalric marched south and joined Shawar against the men who had restored Shawar to office. When Shirkuh learned of the betrayal, he had no time to pretend the alliance could be repaired. The man he had restored now wanted him trapped. The king of Jerusalem was coming, and the first Egyptian struggle was about to close around him. Shirkuh withdrew to Bilais in 1164 and found himself under siege by the combined forces of Shawar and Amalric. The situation was dangerous from every angle. Shirkuh was deep in Egypt, away from Syria, surrounded by enemies who knew the land better than he did. Amalric's Franks brought disciplined cavalry and siege experience. Shawar's Egyptians brought local support, supplies, and the political motive to remove the Syrians before they became permanent masters. Bilais was hammered. Day after day, the pressure increased. Shirkuh could not simply ride out and return to Syria whenever he wished. He had to preserve his army, avoid destruction, and keep enough strength to negotiate from something better than helplessness. Nur al-Din helped by widening the war. While Amalric was tied down in Egypt, Nur al-Din struck in the north. In August 1164, at Harim, he defeated a major coalition of Crusader and allied forces and captured important nobles. That changed Amalric's calculation. The king of Jerusalem could not stay focused only on Egypt, while news from Syria threatened the wider Crusader position. Then came the psychological blow. Later and dramatic accounts describe Nur al-Din using trophies from the northern fighting to break Frankish morale at Bilais. The story says that some of the dead or captured northern Franks were Normans, French-speaking warriors with long blonde braided hair, men whose Viking ancestry still lived in the way they looked and fought. Nur al-Din did not simply cut the hair away. He had them scalped. The skin from the top of the head was sliced away with the hair still attached, turning the blonde braids into a brutal warning. These scalps were tied with captured banners and smuggled into Bilais for Shirkuh. When Shirkuh received them, he had the scalps and banners draped over the walls. To Amalric's men outside the city, the message was meant to land like a threat from home. While they stood in Egypt trying to crush Shirkuh, Crusaders in the north had been beaten badly enough for pieces of their own men to hang over an Egyptian fortress. Even if the story grew in the telling, it captures the pressure of the moment. Amalric had to ask whether victory at Bilais was worth danger at home. His men had to wonder what was happening behind them while they stared at Shirkuh's walls. Negotiation followed. Shirkuh agreed to leave Egypt if Amalric left as well. Both armies withdrew. Shawar kept his office, but his betrayal had taught everyone the same lesson. No agreement in Egypt could be trusted unless it was backed by force. The question was no longer whether Egypt mattered. The question was who would return first and with enough strength to stay. In 1167, Shirkuh returned. Amalric returned too. This time, the contest moved deeper into Egypt and became more dangerous for everyone involved. Shirkuh crossed the Nile and positioned himself in a way that threatened Cairo from the west. Amalric and Shawar had to respond, but they were facing a commander who did not intend to give the Franks the kind of battle they preferred. Frankish heavy cavalry was terrifying when it struck in good order. If knights held formation and had ground to build speed, their charge could break an enemy line in minutes. Shirkuh knew better than to wait for that impact on Amalric's terms. Near Babein in 1167, Shirkuh used movement as a weapon. He drew Amalric away from secure support and into a pursuit that seemed promising at first. The Franks believed they were pressing a retreating enemy. Each mile made that belief more expensive. Heat, distance, and the strain of movement began to work on the army. Shirkuh had not run because he was beaten. He had pulled the Franks into a fight that suited him better. When the moment came, he turned the tables with sudden violence. His cavalry wheeled back against an enemy that had been pulled out of position and worn down by the chase. The Frankish charge no longer had its clean shape. Their support was stretched. Their confidence had carried them into ground where Shirkuh could finally hit them on his terms. Saladin led the charge. The Syrian counterattack landed with devastating effect. What had looked like a pursuit became a reversal. Amalric's men were forced back, battered by an enemy they had thought was slipping away. The battle did not give Shirkuh all of Egypt in a single day, but it proved he could outmaneuver the Franks inside the land Amalric wanted most. Saladin watched and learned. He saw how an enemy famous for strength could be weakened before the main clash began. He saw that heat, distance, and impatience could be as useful as swords. Shirkuh did not rest after Babein. Instead, he rode hard and fast, moving in a way that confused the men trying to track him. Amalric had to gather his remaining strength and recover the shape of his army after the defeat. Before the Franks could regain control of the campaign, news arrived that made the situation worse. Alexandria had fallen. Shirkuh had moved so quickly after Babein that Amalric and Shawar were left trying to understand how he had slipped past the expected rhythm of the campaign. While the Franks looked toward regrouping in Cairo, Shirkuh had raced north and seized one of Egypt's greatest ports. It was a bold stroke. It was also dangerous. A port city could become a prize or a prison. If the enemy controlled the approaches by land and sea, hunger would begin doing the work that swords could not finish. Amalric and Shawar rallied and placed Alexandria under siege. The siege dragged on for months. Inside, the defenders were squeezed by hunger, fear, and the growing sense that the city might not hold. Food ran short, morale weakened. Every day made the walls feel less like protection and more like the edges of a trap. Shirkuh understood that if he stayed inside, the city might be choked into surrender. The Egyptian navy made escape by sea difficult. The siege lines outside the walls were tightening. Supplies were failing. If nothing changed, Alexandria would fall. So Shirkuh chose the kind of answer that made him so dangerous. He selected a fast cavalry force and waited for the enemy to relax. Then, under cover of darkness, he charged out. The breakout was not a quiet escape through a forgotten gate. It was a hard ride through danger, past the Crusader and Egyptian positions before the besiegers could react properly. By the time they understood what had happened, Shirkuh had broken through the ring around Alexandria and reached the open country beyond them. Saladin was left inside the city with a clear order: hold. He was still in his early 20s, and this was one of his first moments of major independent command. His uncle had burst out with the cavalry, leaving him behind with men who knew the siege was worsening. Once outside, Shirkuh did what he did best. He moved violently. With no large army to hold territory, he turned speed into damage. He struck at vulnerable settlements, supply lines, and exposed holdings connected to the Latin kingdom, destroying what he could and refusing to let Amalric treat Alexandria as the only front. Frankish and allied positions were no longer safe simply because the main army stood before the city walls. Shirkuh's rampage made the siege more expensive, more humiliating, and more uncertain. Inside the city, Saladin had a different battle. He had to keep men from breaking. He had to manage hunger, fear, and the bitterness that comes when soldiers begin to believe they have been left behind. He could not solve Alexandria by charging out in glory. He had to keep order long enough for his uncle's pressure outside the city to matter. By the end, Amalric and Shawar could not force the complete result they wanted. Negotiations ended the crisis, and in 1167 the Syrians withdrew again. Amalric had still not gained Egypt. Shawar had survived again. Saladin had learned that holding a city could be as difficult as taking one. No one had solved Egypt. They had only postponed the next invasion. The peace of 1167 was never going to last. Amalric knew that as long as Saladin and Shirkuh were alive, Jerusalem was in danger. 1 year later, the truce shattered for the final time. In 1168, Amalric invaded Egypt again. This campaign carried less patience than the earlier ones. Amalric had seen enough of Syrian ambition to understand the danger. If he hesitated too long, Saladin, Shirkuh, or Nur al-Din's commanders might make Egypt impossible for Jerusalem to reach. The Franks moved with greater aggression, and Shawar found himself trapped by the consequences of his own politics. He had invited Syrians, betrayed Syrians, invited Franks, and then feared the Franks. Fustat, Old Cairo, was evacuated and set on fire so the Franks could not use it. The burning lasted for weeks. A living city beside the Nile turned into smoke because Egypt's ruler feared occupation more than he cared for the people whose homes stood in the path of his strategy. The flames made Shawar look powerless and cruel at the same time. To ordinary Egyptians, he was the man who could not protect them from invasion and then burned their city in front of them. To the Fatimid court, he had become a danger to the survival of the regime. To the Syrians, he was a traitor who had betrayed every agreement. Even the Franks could see that Shawar's authority was collapsing. The Fatimid Caliph, Al-Adid, now faced a dilemma. Amalric's army was too dangerous. Shawar could no longer be trusted. The Syrians were the only force strong enough to push the Franks out, but calling them back meant inviting the same power Shawar had once tried to remove. The Caliph appealed to Nur al-Din. Shirkuh returned in 1169 with enough force to change the balance. Amalric could not remain in Egypt with a Syrian army closing in and local hostility turning poisonous around him. The Franks withdrew. Shawar's career was finished. He was arrested and killed. Some accounts place Saladin himself in the act of execution, showing how close the young nephew now stood to the center of events. Whether seen as justice, necessity, or removal of a man who had betrayed every side, Shawar's death cleared the way for Shirkuh. Shirkuh became Vizier of Egypt in January 1169. Then, before anyone could know what kind of Egypt he would build, Shirkuh was dead. What could kill a man so soon after he had fought his way through betrayal, siege, and war to reach the highest office in Egypt? Shirkuh died suddenly in 1169. Soon after reaching the office he had fought for across years of campaigns. Later accounts connect his death to sudden illness, sometimes described in connection with heavy eating and violent sickness. The exact medical cause cannot be recovered with confidence. The political result is easier to see. Egypt had lost its new master almost as soon as he had taken power. The Fatimid court now had to choose the next vizier. The decision was dangerous. If they chose another hard commander like Shirkuh, they might replace one master with another. If they rejected the Syrian military presence entirely, they risked angering Nur al-Din and losing the only force that had just saved them from Amalric. Saladin seemed to solve the dilemma. He was Shirkuh's nephew, so appointing him preserved the connection to Nur al-Din and satisfied the Syrian troops. He was also young and appeared less threatening than his uncle. To men in the Fatimid court, that made him useful. Maybe he could keep the Syrians calm. Maybe he could please Nur al-Din. Maybe he could be managed. In March 1169, Saladin became Vizier of Egypt. The court had misread him. Saladin's first challenge was survival. He had a Fatimid court that did not truly want him as master, military factions that could revolt, and a formal loyalty to Nur al-Din that limited how openly he could build independent power. He also had Egypt itself, a wealthy country that could collapse into disorder if handled too crudely. Before he had even settled fully into the vizierate, threats began pressing in. Palace factions tested him. Fatimid loyalists watched for weakness. Military units tied to the old order understood that Saladin's rise threatened their place in Egypt. Rebellions and plots forced him to move quickly, not as a distant administrator, but as a man fighting to keep the office that had fallen into his hands. He placed loyal men in important positions and cut away rivals where he had to. He did not try to transform Egypt in one theatrical gesture. That would have invited collapse. He tightened his grip step by step, always needing the country to keep functioning, while he changed who truly controlled it. This is where Saladin's administrative discipline mattered. Taxes had to be collected, soldiers had to be paid, grain had to move. Cairo could not be treated like a captured camp. In 1171, the Fatimid Caliph Al-Adid died. Saladin used the moment to end the Fatimid Caliphate. The Friday sermon was given in the name of the Abbasid Caliph, restoring Egypt to Sunni allegiance. After 2 centuries of Fatimid rule, Egypt's official religious and political alignment shifted. For the Crusader states, the meaning was severe. Egypt was no longer a prize that might be pulled toward Jerusalem through Fatimid weakness. It was becoming the base of a Sunni military ruler. For Amalric, this was the failure he had tried to prevent since 1163. For Nur al-Din, it raised a different problem. The commander in Egypt was becoming too powerful. Amalric also tried to read the crack between Cairo and Damascus. As tensions grew between Saladin and Nur al-Din, the king of Jerusalem had every reason to wonder whether Egypt could be detached from Syria before the two became one threat. But Saladin did not take the bait. Whatever private fears he had about Nur al-Din, he remained publicly loyal to his master and refused to turn Egypt into an ally of Jerusalem against Damascus. Saladin owed his rise to Nur al-Din's world. He had gone into Egypt under Shirkuh, who served Nur al-Din. His legitimacy rested partly on the idea that he represented the wider Syrian cause. In letters and public posture, Saladin showed obedience. The reality, though, was becoming more complicated. By 1171, Saladin controlled Egypt. He had money, soldiers, administrators, and a family network building around him. The longer he ruled from Cairo, the more difficult it became to imagine him handing Egypt back like a temporary command. Nur al-Din saw the danger. He had not spent years building Syrian power, only to watch a subordinate become a rival on the Nile. Tension grew between them, especially when coordinated campaigns required Saladin to act in ways that might bring him too close to Nur al-Din's authority. Saladin avoided direct confrontation more than once. These were not small delays. To Nur al-Din, they looked like a pattern. When Saladin withdrew or failed to meet him in ways that Syria expected, the suspicion hardened. The ruler of Damascus began to lose patience with the ruler of Egypt. At last, Nur al-Din pushed the matter toward the edge. He sent a warning that cut through the polite language. Saladin had to come and submit, or the meaning would be clear. If Egypt would not obey, then war between master and servant was imminent. Saladin considered resistance. That is how dangerous the moment had become. His father, Najm al-Din Ayyub, intervened with the advice that may have saved him. Ayyub understood both Syria and Egypt. He knew Nur al-Din's authority, and he knew that Saladin's power in Cairo was not yet secure enough for a civil war. He urged his son to submit in words, show humility, and avoid the confrontation until time did what pride could not. Saladin followed the advice. He submitted to Nur al-Din outwardly and wrote in the language of obedience. The crisis cooled, but it did not disappear. Nur al-Din had seen enough to know that Egypt was slipping beyond ordinary command. Ayyub did not live much longer. In 1173, Saladin's father died after an accident, traditionally described as a fall from a horse. His death removed the man who had helped restrain Saladin at the most dangerous moment in his relationship with Syria. Without Ayyub, the tension with Nur al-Din might have become even harder to manage. The confrontation seemed to be moving closer. Then something happened that drained the crisis of its force almost overnight. In 1174, Nur al-Din died. For Saladin, the news carried more than political opportunity. Nur al-Din had been his master, the ruler whose cause had opened the road to Egypt, and the man whose authority Saladin had both respected and feared. His death was a loss to the movement that had been built around Syrian unity. It was also, undeniably, the event that freed Saladin from the one man who could still demand his submission. That same year, Amalric of Jerusalem died. Amalric had spent his reign trying to keep Egypt from falling into the hands of Syria's rulers. He had marched into Egypt in 1163, fought through the crisis of 1164, returned during the campaigns of 1167, and pressed again in 1168. He failed each time to make Egypt a possession of Jerusalem. By the time he died in 1174, Saladin held the country Amalric had chased for more than a decade. Everything seemed to fall open for Saladin at once. Nur al-Din was gone, Amalric was gone, Egypt was secure enough to serve as a base. Syria was suddenly exposed to whoever could claim the legacy Nur al-Din left behind. In 1174, Saladin had entered Damascus, and the balance of the east had shifted in a single year. Saladin moved quickly after Nur al-Din's death. He entered Syria and took control of Damascus, presenting himself as protector of Nur al-Din's legacy and guardian of the young heir left behind. He did not yet control every major Muslim city. Aleppo and Mosul still mattered. Rivals remained. The work of unity was not finished. But Damascus changed the shape of his power. Egypt gave him wealth. Damascus gave him position on Jerusalem's flank. Together, they placed the Latin kingdom in the strategic nightmare Amalric had tried to prevent. In Jerusalem, the crown now passed to Amalric's son, a boy stepping onto a throne surrounded by enemies, factions, and the Sultan of Egypt, the ruler of a land that his father had repeatedly failed to conquer for the kingdom. That boy was 13 years old and had leprosy. And before Saladin could turn fully toward Jerusalem, Amalric's sickly son would become the first serious foe standing in his way.